Good morning, YouTube. I have cold soaked the old Peltier Effect fan. We have the helical laminated handmade wooden propeller doing its thing. And as we pan across the messiness of my little interior hovel, we see a couple of incense sticks giving us some smoke. And there we see a pair of chuck gliders in the airflow, which is coherently crossing the room, combining with the slight easterly wind coming in through the door crack, influencing those models. However, there's enough of it going into that little alcove that what comes back out of the alcove has this chuck glider flying above the temperature inversion, while the Spitfire, it flies aligned with the airflow coming back out of the alcove, more or less in trail with the Mustang and the sailplane. And then over here we have the Skycraft Scout and the B-29 and the Wright Flyer, all dangling on a coat hanger and free to respond to the local wind. And the trouble with this thing is it's got sufficient side area up front with what amounts to be end plates across those struts that it more than balances the rudders, twin rudders though they are. When you hang it ready for flight, what I think I need to do is balance that with a lump of solder up the front so I can suspend it, giving the rudders a mechanical advantage over the elevators. Trouble with the canard design. But anyway, the Skycraft Scout flies, the Spitfire with the tropical radiator flies, the big chuck glider flies in the air coming back out of the alcove, the sailplane flies, and the Mustang flies. And the Mustang is in Australian colours. Green on white across red, yellow and black. Best I could do, eh? B-29 is heavily ballasted to make it hang in the right orientation as well. I'm just going to have to alter that. Of course, there is no pilot on the plywood flyer. So that there then is what occurs with a coherent airflow shifted by a perfectly helically twisted propeller. Cobbled up by one So it's not quite as silly as it would necessarily appear at first glance. More or less. So anyway, how about we swap these out? And while we're at it, feast your little eyes on the dust accretion boundary layer airflow demonstration by dust accretion. What you see there is the smoke of a hell of a lot of incense burnt upstream of the fan disc, and it gets bashed onto the flat square 90-degree corners and the perpendicular surface of the leading edge. It bounces away, can't cope with a 90-degree turn, bounces away from the downstream edge until it attempts to get into, well, I think what's going on, in there's a low pressure zone caused by air going over the back of that motor and disc and all the rest of the other obstacles there. So you can see air's coming in from the leading edge and going more or less down to there, to the hub. That part of the disc is working quite well, trying to feed that low pressure zone. Then along this trailing edge, and you can see the shear mark where the sleeve of something brushed it, probably 20 hours worth of operation in the smoke trail ago. But then there's this contact area between the air bouncing off the leading edge, getting picked up by the increased progressive steepening radial curvature. And it's like a reverse camber. All the camber's at the trailing edge, not at the leading edge. There's that dust accretion I was talking about, the white line, compared to the black painted flat 90-degree edge that you can see on the tip. So yeah, it's kind of complicated. And then you can see there's a fore and aft line almost at 90-degree corner down in there between the air that's been compressed and squeezed back into the downstream flow, which is what you want it to do, and that contraflow out there at the tip where the air going through there, it's actually going backwards because it's being sucked so very, very, very hard to try and get into the low pressure zone being generated over here on the upwind side. And there again, you can see that dust accretion. Which is more or less the polar opposite of what goes on this one. With this one, the downstream surface is more or less uniformly coated from the leading edge back. And the leading edge gets to be fairly clean. See how the dust is here. The dust accretes from the leading edge back. We've got all sorts of smudge marks because this is just general day-to-day dust, and this one's been sitting up on a shelf and pulled down and back. So yeah, there's the actual test's been badly abraded on the tip, worse on the other blade than this one. and you can see that's the downstream side, and you get dust accretion thickest more or less at the leading edge, because that's the part of the blade that is basically compressing the air going below the leading edge. And as we come around and we get to see the area of low pressure where the barometric pressure has been lowered by the air being stretched, the molecules are pulled apart as they try to take the longer path over the top of the blade versus the shorter path over the bottom of the blade, while staying at the speed that's comfortable for them. Now, does the air go faster over the top so that it can get to the trailing edge at the same time as the air going under the bottom? There's nothing that says it has to. What actually happens is you get a low pressure zone where the air runs into the leading edge, runs into the leading edge. Some of it bounces down and it runs into the bottom of the blade. And the pressure of the air on the bottom of the blade sticks the dust onto the bottom of the blade. You know, it's not kind of mysterious. The bit of the air that hits the leading edge bounces, and it takes a while before it comes back down, and it manages to stick some dust onto the trailing edge of the blade. And there is the pressure footprint outlined in the dust accretion pattern and the thickness and the density of the dust. And as I said, it's the exact bloody opposite of this thing. This thing moves what air it does move with the last 30% of the camber, and it does that on, let's be honest, it probably does it on 50% of the disc area, because the stuff in at the centre is not doing much, but it is doing something, even though it's basically sort of trying to feed the low pressure zone in here, which has no dust on it. Right? Remember, our dust accretion equals barometric pressure on that part of the structure, sticking the condensing vapor from the incense onto the blades. Yeah, that's kind of sort of what's going on. It's cunning, because it means that, yeah, 50% of the blade is actually doing something more or less productive. The trouble is that bit out there, right, you can see the clean stripe. That's the shear forces and the turbulence between that part of the blade where the flow is actually going from upstream to downstream, and that part of the blade tip where the flow is retroactive, going backwards. How do I show that one there? Yeah. The only thing that has put that stripe, or that little lobe on the dust accretion pattern, the only thing that's done that is air pressure during operation. Right, so now you've got your dust accretion patterns firmly in your head. You've seen the retrograde airflow demonstrated in previous videos, and you've seen by the dust accretion pattern what's going on with this thing, and you've seen the various aeroplanes actually conforming to the airflow coming coherently off the helically pitched unit with the half degraded, rooted, buggered magnets in the motor. And now we've got everything just sort of dangling there. I'm going to stoke up the fire and shut the door and put that one on the stove once this. When that comes up to temperature, I'll replace the incense sticks and put the fan on the stove, and you can see what goes on or not. And we will track the airflow and see where it does go. Because here there's no fans blowing it. It's just rising around the models, and the heat of the smouldering incense stick is enough to wobble the wings. Yeah, probably should get rid of that white stuff in the background for this job. Right, so that's your control. Everything more or less pointed, a little bit higgledy-piggledy, because there's not much wind outside. No one side of the hut is sucking any harder on the cracks in the doors and the walls and the floors than any other side. And I think we just had a pause button malfunction anyway. I'll reshoot that bit. Smoke being sucked in. By cooling air holes. Put there to stop the outer flue from getting too hot and hunting a person out of the room. And now with the top heated up, we will light the incense. We will see where goes the air. And right at the moment, it's showing quite a lot of westerly flow, but the models are not. They're pretty much random. And that one's backwards, for all the reasons hitherto previously explained. That's doing its thing. Now it sucks in less cooling air. Hot plate gets hotter, and we will see what we will see when this little machine gets going and starts to make its softly aggressive purr, which I'm sure a lot of people take to be an indication of how powerful it is, but I take it to be an indication of how wasteful it is, because it should be silent. It should really only make noise if it's out of balance, in my opinion. It's thinking about it. There we go. It's just such a lovely little Peltier unit. And they've handicapped it with a fan that makes more noise than airflow. Fan's going like a champion. We're now getting some airflow, fan blown, arriving over here. The response is kicking in. And it's making confused things happen, because the air comes over here and some of it is going back forced out of that alcove as the hot air goes up, hits the roof, cools down, turns around, comes back down, and sort of argues with the air coming in off the fan as to who's going where. And there's the argument occurring in real time. Are we going back towards the stove, or are we coming over to get trapped in the alcove? And now there's a stabilised airflow coming out of the alcove. These two are hanging. No, that stability was illusory. These two are arguing among themselves. That's right on the conversion shear line. Come around to this side. That's copying wing rocking turbulence. Wing rocking turbulence. A little bit of wing rocking. I submit that what comes off that little fan mixes the air. Yes, it does indeed. But it does not generate any kind of a coherent flow. Because it's turning more energy, more torque into noise than it's managing to turn into thrust. And the noise is coming off the trailing edge of the fan, transmitted to the axle, transmitted to the engine mounts, transmitted to the fan housing, and I've got the case of the phone sitting on top of the fan housing, and that's why you can hear it. So there you go, and now you know. One of the things that's been added to my list of stuff that I've got to do is to make a 7-inch diameter, 4-bladed, laminated, helically pitched propeller to replace that bloody thing. Because guess whose mum had an autistic, obsessive compulsive son? Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Epilepsy warning. Handheld too. You get that?